Welcome back to the Dershow. You may see a little change of background. I'm on Martha's Vineyard now for a few days, and we'll be broadcasting from there. Um, Today, I'm going to talk about a subject I know nothing about: golf. What do I know about golf? I remember meeting a great lawyer friend of mine who hated golf, but he had to play it because the clients wanted to play. So he hated every minute of playing it. And he said to me, Alan, your tombstone will list all your great cases and say, all this without playing golf. So when I was a kid, I played a little pitch and putt and, that kind of thing, but I was never been a golfer. And, golfers, it's a religion. And so I want to pardon myself early on if I make any mistakes about golf. The other thing I want to talk about relating to golf is, of course, something I know a great deal about: human rights, and something I know a considerable amount about: Saudi Arabia. So obviously, you know what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the potential merger that looks like it's moving forward, obviously, between the PGA and the LIV. For those of you who aren't familiar with it, the PGA, of course, is the largest golf tour in the world, has all the great golfers, but now Saudi Arabia, the sovereign fund, which is worth much of the money in the world, has decided to get full time into sports. They actually offered Lionel Messi a mess of money. He turned it down, and he's going to Miami, where I spent some time. So I'm looking forward to seeing him play. But he turned down reported $500 million to go to Saudi Arabia. But a lot of the golfers have accepted LIV's offer and have made fortunes and fortunes of money, much more than they were making in the PGA. And so the question is, should the PGA, which is really very American and stands for American golf, essentially be taken over by the money from Saudi Arabia? Let's start out by remembering a little bit about the PGA. Not the cleanest, not the best organization in the history of the world. Obviously, for years it discriminated viciously against African Americans, against Jews, against women. Discrimination was the name of its game. Many of the golf courses that uh, participated in the tour were restricted to mostly white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. So its history is not one deserving of particular sympathy, and yet it held out against the Saudi Arabian takeover. The head of the PGA said, as long as I'm the head of the PGA, we will never merge or do anything together with the LIV, those Saudis. And of course, then he changed his mind and is now embracing Mohammed bin Salman, MBS, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia. He thinks things change. Yeah, things change. I wouldn't call it change. I would call it large amounts of money. Things are influenced by money. Well, things have changed a little bit in Saudi Arabia. We know, nobody can doubt this, that Saudi Arabia and almost certainly MLB was responsible for the brutal murder and dismembering of Jamal Khashoggi. I was very interested in that for lots of reasons. I represented Jamal Khashoggi's uncle, Adnan Khashoggi. You may remember him. He was a notorious arms dealer who got indicted in New York, along with Mrs. Marcos from the Philippines. And I gave legal advice to Khashoggi. I'll never forget going to his house, his apartment. He had this magnificent apartment, you might imagine, overlooking Central Park. And you walk into his apartment and it looks like a museum. Every major artist, Picasso and Modigliani, everybody is represented on his walls. I know a lot about art. And I was waiting for him to come, and I was looking at the art and I was intrigued by it. I was looking at it with a kind of skepticism. And he said to me, Professor Dershowitz, yes, I see you know art. And I said, yeah, I know a bit about art. He said, then you know. I didn't want to say anything, but I knew. I said, know what? He said, well, you know, you're just being polite. You know these are all fakes. I said, well, I had a sense this one certainly, Modigliani is a fake, because I've seen the real one in a museum just a couple of months ago, and I don't imagine you took it off the wall there or you bought it. It was not for sale. He said, every single one of my pieces of art is a fake, drawn, painted by a great, great faker, the world's greatest fakers. He said, I love fake art. He said, because I myself am a faker. He said, my life has been faking and my art is fake. Well, he got acquitted. So that worked out. That worked out okay. But, I followed the Khashoggi family, and there's no doubt at all by anybody. State Department, the CIA, they have tape recordings. They know, there's absolutely no doubt, the circumstances of Jamal Khashoggi's death. And there's very little doubt that the Crown Prince at least knew about it, and there is some suspicion that he, organized it. Khashoggi, a journalist, a reporter for the Washington Post, was reporting very critically on Mohammed bin Salman and on the regime in general. And so, the ultimate form of censorship is assassination, and that's what they apparently did. Having said that, and without trying to justify or excuse it, under the leadership of MBS, Saudi Arabia has certainly moved away from being perhaps the most repressive regime possibly in the world, executing dissidents and cutting arms off, and keeping women in their homes, having babies, and they've moved quite a bit away from that under MBS. Women now can drive their cars; they can go out unaccompanied by men. There's a small amount of possible dissent, not much. The rampant anti-Semitism of the regime. You couldn't get into Saudi Arabia if you were Jew, or if you were somebody with an Israeli passport. That has changed. And the Saudis, although they're making deals with everybody, they've established now a good relationship with Iran, which is today the most repressive regime in the world. But they've also established under the radar increasing relationships with Israel, and they do a lot of business with Jewish business people. You can get into Saudi Arabia as a Jew without a problem. A little bit of dissent, not much, is tolerated. Much of the royal family is now still imprisoned in hotels to make sure that they don't revolt against MBS. So, as with many repressive countries, it's a mixed picture. Some progress. Would you say it's one step forward, two steps backward? I think it's more likely two steps forward, one really big step backwards. I mean, the murder is inexcusable, and it would be, I think, wise if MBS were to acknowledge at least the role of the country in doing it. But the United States has maintained its good relations with Saudi Arabia as we speak today. Secretary of State Blinken is in Saudi Arabia, sitting with MBS and making arrangements and deals that are in the national interest in the United States. You have to do that. You don't only have alliances with good countries and friends. You have alliances with countries that serve your interest, good or bad. There are no such things as principles, only interests when it comes to foreign relations. And although I think Blinken is more principled than some in the past, still he maintains a policy that's what's good for America, as my grandmother used to say when I would come back from watching a baseball game and saying the Brooklyn Dodgers won. She said, "Yeah, but was that good or bad for the Jews?" She was quite a parochial person, brought up in a shtetl in Eastern Europe, pogroms, murders, and Blinken is a lawyer, brilliant. The American administration is very sophisticated, and they ask the same question. Henry Kissinger asked the same question when he was the Secretary of State and the National Security Advisor. It's a question you have to ask if you're an American government official. Is it good or bad for America? You also have to ask, is it good or bad for human rights? Is it good or bad for the world? So the question I want to pose, and I don't have an answer. And so I really pose this as an open question and would love to see some of your responses. Is it a good development or a bad development for the PGA to merge, take over, be taken over by, have the kind of relationship it now has with the LIV? Will that help perhaps move Saudi Arabia in the right direction? Will it reward Saudi Arabia for its bad ways? We had the same question with Qatar during the World Cup. Qatar obviously paid an enormous amount of money to obtain rights to the World Cup, and it cleaned up its act considerably before the World Cup and before the vote. And maybe it's been moving in the right direction. I know the Emir of Qatar and his brother. I've met with them on a couple of occasions. And individually, personally, they're very nice people. But Qatar is not a free and democratic country where people vote for their leaders and can say anything they want at all times. But it's a country that's very influential in the world. The same thing is true with the Emirates and other countries in the Middle East. They are monarchies. That's a probably polite way of saying dictatorships. They have some parliaments and they have some input from the people, but in the end, the monarch's view prevails. And yet the Emirates have moved in some very good directions. The Abraham Accords were a very, very positive step forward. And we're seeing a slight movement towards civil liberties. I thought that might happen in China as well, when the Chinese economy flourished and China wanted to become part of the world economy. I actually gave some series of lectures in China, and I teach Chinese students on the internet. And I really thought that if it wanted to develop a legal system to attract business, it would also have to develop a legal system that recognized more basic human rights. That hasn't happened. I thought that by incorporating Hong Kong, which has a tradition, a much more democratic tradition than mainland China, perhaps the same thing would happen. It hasn't happened. China has actually moved backwards, away from greater dissent. Yes, it does today guarantee businesses more appropriate protection under the so-called rule of law. But when it comes to Chinese dissidents, I first went to China in 1979, sent there by Ted Kennedy to look into the democracy wall. The beginning flourishes of democracy right after the Cultural Revolution. It really looked like China might be moving in the right direction. And it did. It did for a while. And it's not what it used to be, but it has a long way to go. And of course, we remember the worst experience of this in history when Adolf Hitler essentially bought the Olympics in 1936 in order to present the great Aryan race, winning all of its Olympic medals. Of course, Jesse Owens, who was African American, beat the German runners. And by the way, the person who probably would have come in second was a Jewish kid from Brooklyn. I think his name was Marty Glickman. And he was banned from running because Hitler said, "I don't want any Jews running." And Avery Brundage, who was the head of the U.S. Olympic Committee, was a Nazi lover, a sympathizer with Nazism, and he admired Hitler. And he defrauded the Olympic Committee by changing the vote. And most Olympians were in favor of boycotting the 1936 Nazi Olympics. But Avery Brundage, whose name should never be listed among positive or good people, deserves a special place in hell, was a Nazi admirer, and he manipulated the vote to get the United States to send a team without Jews to the Olympics. And Hitler took advantage of that, and it became an enormous propaganda victory. I'm not saying there's a comparison between Hitler and Saudi Arabia. No, there is not. And I'm not saying that there's a comparison between the way in which Saudi Arabia uses its money, which is enormous, and Hitler's, which didn't have that kind of resources, used his power and influence to bring the Olympics. But a similar question is raised, and the similar question was raised under the presidency of Jimmy Carter when he made the mistake in those days of canceling American participation in the Olympics for reasons that weren't particularly compelling. The Russian invasion, I think it was of Afghanistan. That happens every month, something like that. But Jimmy Carter, always sat on his high horse. And, to postpone an Olympics or to postpone American involvement in Olympics, these kids work day and night for years and years and years to qualify, usually for one Olympics, because every 4 years. And, for certain sports, if you're over 18, if you're over 22, if you're over 25, you're not going to be particularly good. So a lot of young men and women were hurt terribly by Carter's mistaken view to cancel the Olympics. And it was not a view that I think most Americans supported, but Jimmy Carter did it. And so the question remains, is it a good thing? And what could we do if we don't think it's a good thing? It's private industry. The PGA is a private company. It's not a government company. It's supposed to be a non-for-profit corporation, right? And I know a bridge in Brooklyn that's for sale. Part of the PGA is not-for-profit, but part of it, owning the television rights and all of that, is extraordinarily profitable. There are people making money off the PGA. Let me put it that way. There's no doubt in my mind about that. And this decision is all about money. The players who went to the LIV went for money. The PGA boycotted them and said you can't play in the PGA if you play in the LIV, and that was about money. And clearly, the big change that occurred, that was referred to by the head of the PGA, things changed, was money. Money changed hands. I'm not saying under the table or improperly or illegally, but the Saudis have no limit in money. Interesting country. Saudi Arabia and Norway were among the poorest countries in the world at the end of the 19th century. Norway was a welfare case. Saudi Arabia was, a bunch of sand. And then in both instances, God was good to them and gave them land that had oil, natural resources buried under it. People say, Jews were so smart. Why did Moses turn left and go to Israel, which has no oil, instead of going right, where he could have had all the oil in the world? Joke. But oil and natural resources make the difference between Saudi Arabia and Jordan. Jordan's a poverty-stricken country. It's right near Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is one of the richest countries in the world. Bahrain, Qatar, they're all, they're basically family-owned gas stations or oil wells. And so they, use their incredible resources, and they're smart. Saudi Arabia used to have oil. All it had was oil. And then they realized, of course, oil is a diminishing resource that we're going to be, by the end of this century, certainly probably halfway through the century, we will not be using oil. And so the Saudis have created this sovereign fund, and they now own real estate, and they're now buying sports franchises. They own tourist companies. They own so many things. They've diversified, and they've done it very, very well and very successfully. And now they want to do it with golf. And golf is an extraordinarily popular sport in the United States. I admit I do not watch it. I'm going to watch the NBA game, one game each tonight. The third game is usually a really important one. Great teams. Miami, unfortunately, they beat the Celtics. And, of course, the Nuggets, which are the number one team in the NBA today, with the Joker, who may be the number one player in the NBA today. What a phenomenal ball player, a guy as big as he is and as powerful as he is, moves like a point guard. And it's just amazing, passes like a point guard, just an amazing talent, along with so many other talents, LeBron James and others, but he's not in the finals. So I'm going to watch basketball. I watch baseball. I do watch soccer. I take some breaks for a while and go away for half an hour and nothing happens during that half an hour. But sometimes when I go away, the only goal is scored. But golf is not one of the games I watch. But I am watching the NBA. I am watching the PGA LIV merger story, not from the point of view of a golf fanatic, but the point of view from a human rights fanatic. And as a human rights fanatic, and as somebody who cares a lot about the future of Saudi Arabia, which is the most powerful, most populous, the largest country in the Middle East, I care deeply about whether this merger will push the Saudis toward a more liberal approach or toward a more tyrannical approach. My prediction, it will prove it a little bit more toward human rights, a little bit, but not enough. And we won't be satisfied. But money will talk, and we will allow the Saudis to get involved in more and more and more and more sports ventures. And I think the result is they're not going to do again what they stupidly did to Jamal Khashoggi. So many other ways they could have dealt with him, could have arrested him. All right, it would have been a big story because he was an American citizen, but they could have probably gotten away with that. But what they did to him, kind of lulling him into the embassy in Turkey and with a whole team and dismembering him and then taking parts of his body out, and they got caught. They were smart enough. They should have been smart enough to know they were going to get caught. You don't get away with things like that. Well, sometimes you do, but you don't get away with that when you're Saudi Arabia, and they were caught. And I think this higher visibility in golf and soccer and other sports is going to make it harder for MBS to do what he would otherwise perhaps like to do, suppress opposition. And that's also always a matter of degree. The world doesn't seem to care that he's locked up a lot of his relatives in fancy hotels, gilded cages. But when you do something like was done to Khashoggi, the world will care. And President Biden said that as long as Khashoggi is in power, as MBS is in power, there are going to be real problems with the relationships. Well, that hasn't happened. The Saudis are too powerful, and again, interests always prevail over principle. So we'll keep watching the story. I'd be interested, particularly in the questions and comments from people who are golf fanatics, and I'd be interested in knowing what you think. I'm told the majority of players are not happy about this, but we'll see what happens when their incomes go up, whether they remain unhappy or whether dollars can smooth some of the concerns. We'll see. All right. Some questions that have come in. That's why I like your point of view. You are a libertarian, as I am. I am also conservative as well as a Trump supporter. That's not me, that's him. Politically, you may not be on the exact same page. No, we're not on the same page. But your support of the Constitution or our civil liberties makes me pay attention to everything you say about it. Love the show. All right. I consider myself a moderate and appreciate that you stand firm on the Constitution. I try to keep up with your opinions no matter what. If you could, what was your opinion of Vice President Pence's power to reject the Electoral College tally? I don't think he had any power to do that. I think the job of the vice president was simply to count and announce. It's a ministerial job, not a policy job. I don't think the vice president has the right to do that. Having said that, if the shoe were on the other foot, if this were a vice president who was a Democrat and there were some real questions about the election, many of the same people who have said that the vice president doesn't have the power would be saying they did have the power. You never can ever overstate the hypocrisy of academics, of journalists, and of others, both on the left and on the right. But I hope I stick to my principles. I don't think as a matter of constitutional law that the vice president has any power other than to count and to, but if you had a case where there was a strong argument that, for example, the vote was overwhelming in a particular state for candidate A, and the governor, who was from the other side, simply appointed different electors, that might be a question. Would it go to the courts? Would it first have to go through the vice president? These are questions that we've never had to face. We've had a handful of really contested elections in our history. Obviously, the first election involving John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson was a deeply contested and many thought corrupt election. And since then, Tilden Hayes and Gore versus Bush, and obviously the claims of 2020, which I think was one of the least controversial contested elections. My hope is that 224 will be without controversy, and the only way to do that is to establish in advance some kind of a commission that can respond to complaints before they happen, before the vote occurs. And so you don't have sore losers and you don't have people complaining that they lost, but you can real time see if there are problems that have to be solved. And those problems include voting machines, which so far have not been subjected to the kind of scrutiny that I believe voting machines should be subjected to. I'm not saying that any voting machine ever in the past has ever influenced an election the wrong way, but I'm saying there's danger there. And I wrote that in a brief for which I have been criticized, but I stand by my view as somebody who cares deeply about electoral consistency and legitimacy. I want to make sure that when the government delegates to a private company the right to perform a governmental function, namely counting votes, that company has to be as transparent as the government would be. I stick to that position despite the criticism I've gotten for it. All right, Trump will be indicted on some pretext, and then again by Smith, and a third time by the woman in Georgia, as the efforts continue to derail him in 2024. It surely looks that way. It surely looks that way. It surely looks like what I wrote about in my book, Get Trump, has absolutely come to pass. That there is, whether it's a concerted effort or individual efforts that combine together to produce a concerted result. But if you read my book, Get Trump, you'll see I predicted this. I predicted that he would be indicted for obstruction of justice, not for the classified material. I believe that he would be indicted by Bragg on a fake, made up, completely concocted false charge, and maybe even convicted because it's New York City, and 87% of the New Yorkers who are likely to be on the jury voted anti-Trump. I think we don't know what's going to happen in either Washington, D.C. or in Fulton County, but I don't see, based on the evidence that I now know, those cases having any teeth. And, maybe there's an obstruction case, but I haven't seen the evidence. What I've seen is a tough guy who fights back and doesn't roll over and says to the government, you're trying to get me. I'm not going to make it easy for you. Go to court. We'll challenge you. No, we're not going to make it easy for you. And we're not going to do what Joe Biden did, cooperate completely and turn over everything. No, we're going to fight back. That's constitutionally protected conduct, not obstruction of justice. We'll see. We'll see what happens. We'll see if there's an indictment, and if so, what it says. Thank you, Professor, for your thoughtful commentary. Your show reminds me of a law school class. Good. That's what I wanted to make it like. A law school class. I wish I had the technology to do it more interactively with you. I'd love to conduct a Socratic seminar with you the way I did for 50 years at Harvard. At Harvard, my reputation was there's no such thing as a right answer in Dershow's class, because every answer begot more questions and harder questions. The best answers were the ones that provoked the best questions. I remember Ted Cruz, walked into the class the first day with his right hand raised, ready to talk, ready to take me on, ready to confront me, ready to challenge me, ready to criticize me. And I loved it. I loved it. I didn't have to play the devil's advocate with Ted Cruz. The devil himself was there from the point of view of the students. They thought he was this, right-wing fanatic, and they loved to see him take me on and me to respond and them to come to their own conclusions. That's what teaching is all about. And it continues. Most of the talking heads on TV cannot provide an unbiased opinion of current topics for a very obvious reason. If you try to provide an unbiased opinion on CNN, you're going to be fired. Look, the head of CNN was fired today. The former head of CNN was fired some years ago. There's now a move to try to maybe bring him back, even though he has a questionable background. But you can't provide an unbiased view. Anybody who ever was unbiased on CNN is in the wastebasket of history. What you have is people like Christine Amanpour, the least unbiased foreign person you ever can imagine. Can you imagine her making the following statement? Here you have a case in Israel where terrorists from Hamas come up to a car which has a mother and two young children in it. The terrorists shoot the car up And then to make sure everybody in the car is dead, they walk up to the car and they fire automatic weapons into the bodies of these dying or dead people. How does Amanpour describe it? It's a shootout, like the shootout in the OK Corral. Oh, these children probably had automatic weapons and was shooting back at the terrorists, and the sheriffs were only defending themselves. It was a shootout. No. Finally, after a lot of pressure, Amanpour admitted that she had made a slip of the tongue. But it wasn't a slip of the tongue. It may have been a Freudian error, but every one of the errors she has ever made in her career dealing with Israel has always gone against Israel. And so I issued a challenge. Find me an error you ever made that favored Israel. And I'm now consulting with the family of these people who were killed to see if there's any legal steps that can be taken against CNN. As you know, I'm also suing CNN for defaming me. So stay tuned. We'll see what happens in the media war, and we'll see what happens in the Gulf war. And in the meantime, everybody have a good weekend. See you next week.